Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A good day to all of you. Today we'll continue our lesson on the ISO 14000 requirements under Clause 7 supports. We already finished on Clause 6 planning previous lecture, so today we'll continue on Clause 7 supports. Under Clause 7, they have 5 subclauses, which is 7.1 resources, 7.2 competence, 7.3 awareness, 7.4 communications, and 7.5 documented information. Under Clause 7 support is all about the execution of the plans and a process that enable an organization to meet its EMS. This is a very powerful requirement covering all EML resources needs. Organization will need to determine the necessary competence of people doing work that's under its control, affect its environmental performance, its ability to fulfill its compliance obligations, and ensure they receive appropriate training. In addition, organizations need to ensure that all people doing work under the organization control are aware of the environmental policy, how their work may impact this, and the implication of not conforming with the environmental management system. Finally, there are requirements for the documented information with related to the creation, updating, and control of specific data. 7.1 Resources. If you refer to the ISO 14001 under subclause 7.1 resources, the requirement stated that the organization shall determine and provide the resources needed for the establishments, implementations, and maintenance and continual improve of its EMS. What is resources? So resources include many things that the organization need to determine to identify the necessary resources for them to establish, implement, maintaining, and also improving the EMS. What is resources? Resources could be anything that required by the organizations that for them to establishing, implementing, and maintaining and also improving their EMS. And these resources include infrastructure, externally provided resources, information system, competence, technology, financial, human resource, and also other resources. You can read all this detail in the ISO 14004. For better understanding, in general, we can classify resources into three types. First, human resource, from which function of department and what kind of skill required and how many number of the people or workers that required. Second, about the physical, such as the facility, equipment, technology. This can be associated with the infrastructure. And of course, the last one is about the financial. You required finance to purchase all the infrastructure or to pay the salary for the human resources. This is an example how the Canon Marketing Neighborhood puts a statement on how they fulfill this requirement under 7.1 resources. The Canon Marketing Malaysia's Neighborhood listed the resources of the company to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the EMS. The resources chart is led by the CEO, Mr. Andrew Koo, that assigned the Human Resources Director. The Human Director are supported by 11 leaders of resources team. So you can see the 11th box that actually related to their departments that provided resources to support the EMS. 7.2 Competence. The organization shall determine the necessary competent persons doing work under its control that affect its environmental performance and its ability to fulfill its compliant obligation. Second, the organization should ensure that these persons are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, or experience. And also, the organization should determine training needs associated with its environmental aspect and its environmental management system. Lastly, where applicable, take action to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of action taken. And all this shall be retained appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. What is competence? Competent means a person have a specific range of knowledge, skill, or ability to do something successfully. So here an example. If you refer the ISO 14004, it show you how we can determine the competence needs. For example, the potential area of competence as environmental technology. So what is their role as environmental technicians? An example of competence, proficiency in environmental sampling or ability to operate monitoring equipment. Example to establish this competent person could be a training and assessment on collection requirement and practice, or could be a certification or license for equipment use. So you can read further by referring to the ISO 14004. 7.3 Awareness. It's required the organization to ensure that person doing work under organization control aware of the environmental policy, the significant environmental aspect, and the related actual and potential environmental impacts associated with their works. Their contribution to the effectiveness of the EMS, including the benefit of enhanced environmental performance, and lastly, the implication of not conforming with the EMS requirement, including not fulfilling the organization compliant obligations. So here is very clear, it's required the organization to ensure their workers aware about these four things. 7.4 Communications. Under this subclass, they have a divide into another three subclass, which is 7.4.1 General Requirement, 7.4.2 Internal Communications, 7.3 External Communication. Let's go to the gender requirements. 7.4.1. What's the requirement here? The organization shall establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed for the internal and external communication relevant to the environmental management system, including A. On what it will communicate, B. When to communicate, C. With whom to communicate, and D. How to communicate. Therefore, the organization shall take into account its compliant obligation, and at the same time, the organization shall take into account its compliant obligations, ensure that environmental information communicated is consistent with information generated within the environmental management system, and it is reliable. The organization shall respond to relevant communication on its environmental management system, and this all the process shall retain documented information as evidence of its communication as appropriate. Next, 7.4.2 Internal Communication. The organization shall internally communicate and information relevant to the EMS among the various levels and functions of the organization, including the environmental management system as appropriate. Ensure its communication process enable person doing work under the organization control to contribute continual improvement. And the last sub-requirement under 7.4 communications, which is the external communication. The organization shall externally communicate information relevant to the environmental management system as established by the organization communication process and as required by its compliant obligation. So this is an example of Canon Marketing Malaysia Sdn Bhd show how they fulfill 7.4 communication. They have running a several program to communicate to various individuals, various level and functions of the organizations. The last sub-clauses under clause 7 support 7.5 documented informations. So here they have three subclause 7.5.1 gender requirement, 7.5.2 creating and updating, and 7.5.3 control of documented information. Let's go the gender requirement first. The organization environmental management system shall include a documented information required by this international standard. B. Documented information determined by the organization has been necessary for the effective of the EMS. If you refer to ISO 14004, documented information of ISO 14001 are really important to ensure that the environmental management system operate effectively. And also, documented information of ISO 14001 is very important to ensure that all employee and other relevant interested party understood their environmental management system. And this documented information of ISO 14001 is very important because to ensure that all the system is carrying out as a plan. And what is documented information? It could be a record document that should be written as evidence in order to demonstrate effective implementation of the environmental management system requirements. And this document could be a manual, working instruction, flowchart, plan, and others. And all these documents should be maintained as appropriate to ensure that this document consistency, timeliness, and repeatability of the outcomes. Next, 7.5.2 creating and updating. In this requirement, when creating and updating documented information, the organization shall ensure appropriate A. Identification and description, B. Format and media, C. Review and approval for suitability and adequacy. And this documented information required by the EMS and by this international standard shall be controlled to ensure it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed, and it is adequacy protected. For the control of documented information, organizations shall address the following activity as applicable: distributions, access, retrieve and use, storage, prevention, including prevention of legibility, control of change, retention, and depositions. Documented information of external determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the EMS shall be identified as appropriate and controlled. So here, if you refer to ISO 14004, it will explain what is the documented information that required under the ISO 14001.